The air was thick with tension as the funeral of General Edward Dawson took place. What was meant to be a moment of solemn respect and remembrance quickly turned into something far darker. One man's hate would challenge everything this country had fought to protect. In an unbelievable twist, a racist cop drew a gun at a military general in the middle of a funeral. But what happened next would leave the world stunned. Before we dive into this shocking story, where in the world are you watching from? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to this channel for more gripping stories like this. It was a somber morning in a small town. The clouds hung low, threatening rain, but the tension in the air was more palpable than any storm. A funeral was underway, one that had drawn not just the local community, but dignitaries from all over the country. The deceased, General Edward Dawson, had served his country for over 30 years. He was known for his valor, his leadership, and his unwavering commitment to justice. Today, his friends, family, and fellow soldiers were gathering to pay their respect. As the sound of bagpipes filled the air, Officer Tyler Andrews, a police officer from the local precinct, stood just outside the crowd. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, with a demeanor that hinted at a deep disdain for authority. He had always believed himself above the rules, especially when it came to people of color. His reputation for racial prejudice was well known, even if it had never been officially documented. But today was different. Officer Andrews had been assigned to provide security at the funeral, a job he hated, but one that came with an air of importance. As the crowd gathered around the flag-draped casket, Tyler stood rigidly, his eyes scanning the crowd with a sense of superiority. His gaze lingered on the military personnel, the soldiers in uniform, who lined up near the front. The air was thick with sorrow and respect, yet Andrews felt none of it. As General Dawson's widow Helen stepped up to deliver her eulogy, the crowd fell into an eerie silence. Her voice cracked with grief as she spoke of her late husband's heroism. Tyler's gaze was fixed on her, his thoughts far removed from the ceremony. He couldn't understand why people held the military in such high regard. He believed the men and women in uniform were just like him, ordinary people who thought they were above the rest. But then something happened. A tall, imposing figure stepped into the scene. Colonel Jackson Hayes, a decorated military general who had served alongside Dawson for decades, approached the podium. He was the man of the hour, the one everyone respected, the one everyone would turn to for guidance. As the crowd parted for him, Andrew's eyes narrowed. He didn't like the way the crowd reacted to Hayes, the way they deferred to him as though he were royalty. With every step Hayes took, Andrew's resentment grew. He watched as Hayes shook hands with dignitaries, as people bowed their heads in reverence. His anger bubbled up, and he found himself clenching his fists, his mind racing with thoughts of how easy it would be to put an end to it all. He had been humiliated by people like Hayes for years, and today it felt as if he were being suffocated by their respect. Just as Hayes approached the podium, the crowd was suddenly interrupted by a loud voice. "What's he doing here?" Tyler muttered under his breath, more to himself than anyone else. Before anyone could react, he started walking toward the front of the crowd, his steps heavy and deliberate, his face twisted with anger as he approached Colonel Hayes. The tension was thick enough to be cut with a knife. "Hey," Andrews yelled, his voice loud enough to be heard over the murmurs of the crowd. "You're not supposed to be here." Hayes, taken aback, stopped in his tracks, his eyes locked with Andrews, who was now inches from him. The crowd fell silent, the whispers fading into nothingness. Everyone watched, unsure of what would happen next. Hayes, ever the professional, remained calm. "Excuse me, officer, but this is a funeral. I am here to honor my friend and comrade." But Andrews was beyond reason. His hatred for the military, for anyone he deemed as above him, had clouded his judgment. Without thinking, he stepped even closer to Hayes, his hand instinctively moving toward the holster at his side. "Get back," Andrews barked. "I don't care who you are. You don't belong here." The tension in the air was unbearable. It felt as if time itself had stopped. And then, in a flash of madness, Andrews drew his gun, pointing it directly at Colonel Hayes. The crowd gasped, some retreating in fear, others frozen in shock. Hayes' eyes widened, but he didn't flinch. The man was a soldier, a leader, and he wasn't about to let some disgruntled cop intimidate him. But the crowd was on edge, and they knew the situation could spiral out of control at any moment. "Put the gun down, officer," Hayes said, his voice firm but calm. Andrews didn't respond. His hands were shaking, and his mind was a whirlwind of rage and confusion. He had no idea what he was doing. The reality of the situation hit him too late. He had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Behind Andrews, someone made a move. A young soldier, one of Dawson's closest comrades, rushed forward. "Don't do it," he shouted, his voice breaking with fear and urgency. The soldier reached for Andrews' arm, trying to pull the gun away, but Andrews reacted instinctively, swinging the weapon in his direction. A struggle ensued, and the crowd began to panic. People screamed, ducking for cover as the officer and the soldier fought for control of the weapon. The sound of sirens echoed in the distance, but they were too far away to help. The situation was out of control, and there was no telling how it would end. The struggle between Officer Andrews and the soldier intensified, each trying to gain control of the firearm. Andrews' heart raced in his chest, the weight of his actions now dawning on him. The gun felt heavy in his hand as if it were no longer an object of power, but a symbol of his complete loss of control. Sweat poured down his face, his vision narrowing as panic took hold of him. The soldier was relentless, pulling at Andrews' arm with all his strength, but the officer's grip on the gun remained firm. The sound of struggling bodies echoed through the crowd, causing chaos to erupt. People screamed, some running for safety, others ducking behind tombstones, unsure of what was going to happen next. "Let go of the gun," the soldier shouted, his voice hoarse with fear. He was younger, faster, and had the advantage of surprise. Andrews, however, had more experience in combative situations, and despite his mounting panic, he fought to retain control. "Stay back," Andrews shouted again, his words laced with hysteria. The gun wavered between the two men, pointing in all directions as they fought for dominance. In that moment it felt as though the world around them was falling apart. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, now tinged with real fear, as they watched the scene unfold in front of them. Then, just as the soldier seemed to gain the upper hand, Andrews twisted violently, throwing the young man off balance. The gun was momentarily free, aimed at the soldier's chest. The crowd gasped, the tension so thick that it felt as if the air itself was holding its breath. But before anyone could react, Colonel Hayes, standing calmly behind the chaos, stepped forward. His eyes were sharp, calculating, and full of resolve. The time for fear and hesitation was long gone. "Officer, stop," he commanded, his voice ringing out with authority. Andrews froze for a split second. It was the kind of moment that could change everything. Hayes's presence was overpowering, his stature commanding respect. The officer's eyes flickered with uncertainty, but his fingers tightened around the gun. "What did you say to me?" Andrews sneered, his voice cold with defiance. "Who do you think you are, huh?" Hayes stood his ground, unwavering. "I am a man who's seen far too much to let this go any further. You're about to make a mistake, and you won't be able to undo it." Andrews blinked, confusion flashing across his face. His mind was a tangled mess. Hayes's words struck a nerve. The officer had been to enough funerals, enough tragedies to understand the weight of life. But he had never felt so alienated, so full of rage that his own judgment seemed clouded. The desire to feel powerful, to dominate, had led him to this breaking point. "You think you can just walk in here, be the hero?" Andrews spat, his voice full of venom. He was shaking now, and the power he once felt with the weapon had begun to slip away. His grip faltered. "You don't have to do this," Hayes said, his voice calm and steady. He was no longer just a general. In that moment he became something far more essential, a voice of reason in the face of madness. For a moment, the tension in the air seemed to release, just slight. Andrews hesitated, his finger twitching on the trigger. The young soldier, bruised but still standing, took a step back, his eyes pleading for the officer to calm down. But the madness that had taken over Andrews was not so easily extinguished. His eyes burned with a mixture of fear, anger, and confusion. He could feel the eyes of the crowd on him, the weight of their judgment heavy on his shoulders. Was this what he had become? The man who was willing to tear down everything. For what? For a fleeting moment of power. "Just let it go, Andrews," Hayes said softly, his eyes locking with the officer's. The gun wavered again, and for a moment, the world felt like it was suspended in time. Then, in a split second, Andrews made a decision. His finger pulled the trigger, but not at Hayes. The shot rang out, echoing through the cemetery, striking the ground inches away from the soldier's feet. The crowd gasped, But it wasn't just fear that ran through their veins, it was disbelief. The situation had spiraled so quickly, and they had no idea how it would end. For a moment, everything fell silent. The gun's echo reverberated in the ears of everyone present. The reality of what had just happened, sinking in. Officer Andrews stood frozen, the gun still gripped tightly in his hand. His chest heaved, his breath ragged as he tried to make sense of the chaos he had unleashed. "You need to surrender now," Colonel Hayes said, stepping closer, his voice unwavering. But Andrews didn't respond. He couldn't. His body was trembling too violently. In the distance, sirens wailed louder, signaling the arrival of backup, but in the officer's mind it was already too late. He had crossed the line, and there was no turning back. "Drop the weapon," a voice called from behind, and Andrews turned to see several other officers rushing toward him. They had heard the shot, and now the reality of the situation was undeniable. Andrews was the center of it all. The officer looked down at the gun in his hand, his fingers slowly loosening their grip. He couldn't move, couldn't think. His mind was drowning in guilt, the magnitude of his actions closing in on him. "Officer Andrews, it's over," another officer said, his voice low and filled with regret. Andrews dropped the gun. The sound of sirens grew louder, the shrill noise signaling the arrival of backup. Officers flooded into the scene, their weapons drawn, their eyes trained on Officer Tyler Andrews, whose hands were now empty, the gun lying several feet away. The crowd was still frozen in disbelief, their eyes shifting from Andrews to Hayes, who stood firm, never once flinching from the chaos that had unfolded. As more officers moved in, Andrews remained unmoving, his body shaking uncontrollably. The sight of his own actions, the irrational outburst, the deadly weapon aimed at a man honor. The moment he had almost thrown everything away, hit him like a wave crashing against the shore. He was no longer in control. The power he once thought he had was nothing more than a fleeting illusion, and the consequences of his reckless actions now began to materialize. The young soldier, who had been caught in the crossfire, limped toward Andrews, his body bruised but his spirit unbroken. His gaze was hard, but there was no hatred in it, only the cold, sharp recognition that Andrews had crossed a line that would leave him forever marked. "You've just thrown your career away," the soldier said softly, his voice filled with a mix of disappointment and pity. Andrews' head hung low. The weight of the soldier's words felt heavier than anything he had ever experienced. He had always prided himself on his position, his authority, but now, in this moment of vulnerability, he realized how hollow those things had been. His arrogance had led him down a dark path, one that he couldn't undo. Colonel Hayes stepped forward, his gaze never leaving the officer. "You made a dangerous mistake today, Andrews, but it's not just about you, it's about the message you sent, the people you endangered. You've put everyone here at risk." Andrews' knees buckled, and he sank to the ground, his hands pressed to his face in a mix of disbelief and shame. How had it come to this? How had the man who had once worn his badge with pride become the man who pointed a gun at a respected military general in the middle of a funeral? The backup officers quickly restrained Andrews, their hands firm but not cruel. They had seen men fall from grace before, but this was different. This was a man whose hatred, fueled by a deep-seated racial prejudice, had almost led to something far worse. They didn't have to speak. The unspoken judgment was clear in their eyes. "Tyler Andrews," one of the officers said, his voice stern, "you're under arrest for assault with a deadly weapon, endangering public safety and misconduct in office. You have the right to remain silent." The words seemed to echo in Andrews' mind, as he was cuffed and led away. There was no fight left in him now. He had wanted power, control, respect. But instead, all he had earned was the scorn of his colleagues, the anger of the crowd, and the complete unraveling of his career. As Andrews was escorted to the police car, he glanced back over his shoulder. Hayes stood at the center of the crowd, watching him with an expression of quiet resolve. The general had been a beacon of composure throughout the entire ordeal, but there was no mistaking the disappointment in his eye. The crowd began to disperse slowly, some whispering in shock, others exchanging solemn glances. The funeral, which had started as a dignified farewell to a hero, had turned into something far darker. And though the immediate threat had been neutralized, the damage had already been done. Later that evening, the news spread like wildfire. The incident at General Dawson's funeral was all anyone could talk about. Headlines blared, social media exploded, and across the nation, people expressed their outrage, disbelief, and sadness. It wasn't just about what had happened at the funeral. It was about the bigger picture, the deep-rooted issues that had allowed a man like Officer Tyler Andrews to rise to power in the first place. The public demanded justice. They wanted to know how a man who had shown such blatant disregard for life had been allowed to carry a weapon, wear a badge, and serve the community for so long. There were calls for immediate investigations, for accountability, and for an overhaul of the system that had allowed this to happen. As Andrews sat in the holding cell, his mind raced. The walls felt like they were closing in on him. What had he done? His career was gone. His reputation was shattered. The worst part was knowing that there was no way to escape the consequences of his action. He tried to think of a way out, tried to convince himself that he could still salvage something from this nightmare. But deep down, he knew it was too late. The bridge had been burned, and there was no rebuilding it. Meanwhile, Hayes and the other soldiers who had been at the funeral were speaking to the press, recounting the events of the day in painstaking detail. They made it clear that Andrews' actions were unacceptable, and that they would be pushing for full accountability. Hayes, though deeply affected by the events, stood firm in his resolve. He knew that this incident wasn't just about one rogue officer. It was about a system that had failed to protect the very people it was meant to serve. As the news coverage of the incident continued to spread, Andrews found himself at the center of a firestorm. His every move, his every word was scrutinized by the public, and his once comfortable life now seemed like a distant memory. The days following Officer Tyler Andrews' arrest were filled with a whirlwind of media coverage, public outrage, and legal proceedings. What had started as an isolated incident at a funeral had quickly transformed into a national scandal. News outlets across the country were eager to dissect every detail, from Andrews' violent outburst to the apparent racial motives behind it. Social media exploded with hashtags and heated debates, with people from all walks of life demanding justice for the man who had nearly pulled the trigger on a military general during one of the most solemn moments of his life. Inside the prison cell where Andrews was being held, the former officer spent his days in a daze. The walls seemed to close in around him, and every sound, every flicker of light, reminded him of the enormity of what he had done. His hands, once so sure and confident as he wielded authority, now trembled as he tried to process the consequences of his actions. It felt as though everything he had built over the years had come crashing down in an instant, leaving him with nothing but regret. But it wasn't just Andrews' life that had been destroyed. The incident at General Dawson's funeral had reverberated through the entire police department, stirring up conversations about corruption, systemic racism, and the need for change. Officers who had once turned a blind eye to Andrews' behavior were now questioning their own roles in a broken system. There were murmurs of reform, of calls for greater accountability within the police force. As Andrews sat in his cell awaiting trial, he couldn't help but feel the weight of the world pressing down on him. It wasn't just the guilt of his actions that tormented him. It was the realization that he had failed in every way imaginable. He had failed the people he swore to protect. He had failed his colleagues, his community, and most of all, he had failed himself. Meanwhile, Colonel Hayes, the man who had been the target of Andrews' rage, was still processing the events of that fateful day. While the incident had shaken him to his core, he had maintained his composure throughout. Now, in the aftermath, Hayes was speaking out to the press, making it clear that Andrews' actions were not only unjust, but a reflection of a much larger problem. The actions of Officer Andrews do not reflect the values of the men and women who serve in law enforcement with honor and integrity, Hayes said during a press conference. This is a wake-up call for all of us. It's a stark reminder that we must do better for the community, for our country, and for the people who trust us to protect them. There were those who defended Andrews, claiming that he had acted out of frustration and had been under pressure for too long. They painted him as a victim of a broken system, one that had failed to support him during his time of need. Others, however, were less sympathetic. They saw Andrews as a man who had used his position of power to bully and intimidate, and his actions were simply the result of deep-seated prejudice. As the trial date approached, the tension surrounding the case continued to grow. Protesters gathered outside the courthouse, demanding justice for General Dawson and the military community. Some carried signs that read, "Racist cops have no place in our society," while others shouted slogans calling for an end to racial profiling and police brutality. The scene was a stark contrast to the peaceful funeral where Andrews had once stood, his mind filled with hatred. Inside the courtroom, the tension was palpable. Andrews sat quietly at the defense table, his face devoid of emotion. He had been charged with assault with a deadly weapon, endangerment, and misconduct in office. The prosecution had a solid case, and it was clear that the consequences for Andrews were going to be severe. His once prominent career in law enforcement was now nothing more than a distant memory. Colonel Hayes was called to the stand as a key witness. The general spoke with calm authority, recounting the events of the funeral in vivid detail. He described the moment when Andrews had pointed the gun at him, the raw fear that had surged through the crowd, and the feeling of disbelief that had overwhelmed him. Hayes didn't mince words. He made it clear that Andrews' actions had been fueled by nothing more than racial hatred and personal insecurity. "I have served my country honorably for decades," Hayes said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I have fought alongside the finest men and women this country has ever seen. But nothing could prepare me for the ugliness of that moment. Officer Andrews put us all in danger. He put everyone at that funeral in harm's way. And for what? Because of the color of my skin." His words sent a ripple through the courtroom. There was no denying the depth of the emotion in Hayes's voice, and his testimony left an indelible mark on the jury. But it wasn't just Hayes's testimony that was stirring the pot. Andrews' defense team tried to argue that the officer had acted in self-defense, that he had been provoked by the perceived disrespect of the military personnel at the funeral. They painted him as a man who had been pushed to his breaking point, a man who had been struggling with personal issues and emotional distress. But it was a hard sell. The public had already made up their mind, and the evidence against Andrews was overwhelming. In the days leading up to the verdict, the pressure mounted. Andrews spent his nights in a cold, dark cell, unable to escape the reality of what he had done. His thoughts often returned to the moment at the funeral, to the look in Colonel Hayes's eyes as he stood there, unflinching in the face of danger. Andrews could never undo that moment. It would follow him for the rest of his life. The courtroom was packed, and the atmosphere was thick with anticipation. Andrews sat at the defense table, his once confident posture now slouched with the weight of the past few weeks. The trial had been long and grueling, with the evidence clearly pointing to his guilt. There was no denying it. He had pointed a gun at a respected military general at a funeral, inciting chaos and terrorizing everyone around him. The public had already passed judgment, and the media coverage had only amplified the urgency for justice. The defense had done its best to argue that Andrews was a victim of his circumstances, that his actions had been provoked, that he had been under immense stress, and that his prejudices were a product of a broken system. But the jury wasn't buying it. The prosecution's case was too strong, and Colonel Hayes's testimony had sealed the deal. He had spoken with such raw honesty, recounting the events of the day with a calmness that contrasted sharply with the intensity of what had transpired. The judge entered the courtroom, his gavel striking with a finality that silenced the room. It was time for the verdict. Andrews, his face pale, looked up at the judge, hoping against hope that somehow, some way, the outcome wouldn't be as harsh as everyone expected. "Officer Tyler Andrews," the judge began, his voice steady, "you have been found guilty of assault with a deadly weapon, endangering public safety, and misconduct in office. Your actions on the day of General Dawson's funeral were reckless, dangerous, and unforgivable." Andrews felt his heart drop into his stomach. It was as if the words had been spoken in slow motion, each syllable echoing in his mind. He had known this moment was coming, but hearing it aloud, hearing it as the judge pronounced his fate, made it all the more real. "The court has considered the severity of your actions," the judge continued, his gaze fixed on Andrews. "You put the lives of countless individuals at risk, and for that the consequences will be severe." The room was deathly quiet, the only sound the tapping of Andrews' fingers on the table. He had once been a man of authority, a man who had been entrusted with a badge and a gun to protect and serve. But now, all of that had been stripped away. "Officer Andrews," the judge said, his voice carrying weight, "you are hereby sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole." The words hit Andrews like a punch to the gut. His breath caught in his throat, and for a moment, everything around him blurred. He was no longer a police officer. He was just a man facing the consequences of his own hatred, his own actions. The realization of his fate was crushed. As Andrews was led away in handcuffs, the crowd in the courtroom remained silent, some with expressions of relief, others with a sense of sorrow. The courtroom doors closed behind him, and for the first time, he felt the full weight of his isolation. His world had crumbled, and there was no way to put the pieces back together. Outside the courtroom, the media was abuzz. Reporters lined the hallways, their cameras flashing as they reported on the sentence. The incident at General Dawson's funeral had become a symbol of everything wrong with the system, a wake-up call for law enforcement and for society as a whole. People were angry, but they were also hopeful. They hoped that Andrew's conviction would be the catalyst for much-needed reform. It wasn't just about one officer anymore. It was about the future, a future where such incidents would never happen again. Colonel Hayes, who had been in the courtroom throughout the trial, stepped outside into the brisk air. His expression was solemn, but there was a glimmer of hope in his eyes. The sentence was a victory, yes, but it was also a reminder of the work still to be done. The fight for justice, equality, and accountability had only just begun. In the weeks that followed, protests and rallies continued to be held across the country, calling for further police reform and an end to racial profiling. While Andrew's conviction brought some measure of justice, it also served as a painful reminder of the work that still lay ahead. The fight for systemic change was far from over. As for Officer Tyler Andrews, life in prison was a harsh reality he would have to face every day. He had destroyed everything he once held dear: his career, his reputation, and his own sense of identity. In the quiet solitude of his cell, he would be forced to confront the demons he had tried to suppress for so long. The road to redemption, if it even existed, was long and uncertain. But one thing was clear: the world had watched, and the consequences of his actions would echo through the generations. His story would serve as a cautionary tale, a reminder that no one, not even those who wear badges of authority, are above the law. And as the sun set on the courthouse that day, the world took one step closer to healing, knowing that justice had been served, at least in part, but the work was far from finished.